Chapter 1. The Pinnacle of Wealth. Come now, let us begin our quiet journey. Let the world of today, with all its speed and its sharp electric light, begin to soften and fade away. Allow the edges of your awareness to blur as we drift back together through the gentle, misty corridors of time to a different age. We travel to a world that moved at the pace of a turning tide, a world lit by the soft, forgiving glow of firelight and moonlight. Our story takes place in a great and ancient port city, a place of stone quays and winding alleyways, a city that grew rich and powerful on the slow, steady pulse of the sea. Imagine this city as the sun begins its final, graceful descent. The brilliant, hard light of the afternoon softens into a warm, honey gold, bathing the ancient, weathered stones of the buildings in a gentle, benevolent glow. The frantic, daytime energy of the port begins to subside. The loud, sharp cries of the gulls are replaced by their softer, more mournful evening calls. The rhythmic, percussive sound of the shipbuilder's hammers, which has echoed through the day, falls silent one by one. The great, bustling river of commerce, the endless flow of carts and porters and merchants, slows to a gentle, meandering stream. The air, once buzzing with the sharp, exciting sense of salt, tar, and the shout of hard-working folks, now calms down. As evening sets in, a warm blend of scents fills the air. Smoky wood from fires, the sweet smell of bread baking, and a dash of exotic spices, all wrapped up in the calm of nearby warehouses. Doesn't that sound inviting? And in this city, at this golden hour of quiet transition, lived a man who was the very heart of its prosperity. His name was Kellen. He was not a nobleman, born to his position, nor a conqueror who had taken it by force. He was a merchant. Through years of patience and wisdom, he developed an almost magical knack for understanding the deep currents of trade. He built an incredible fortune, so solid that his name became a go-to symbol for success itself. He was not just a man of wealth. He was a pillar of the city's confidence, a great, stable anchor of a man in the sometimes turbulent waters of the world. As he walked home now, through the familiar, winding streets, his steps were slow and deliberate. He moved with the easy, unshakable calm of a man who has mastered his world, a man for whom surprise and anxiety were distant. Foreign lands he had not visited in many, many years. Before returning to his quiet, comfortable home, his path would always take him for a final, peaceful moment of the day to his great warehouse by the port. It was the largest in the city, a magnificent, cavernous building of dark, heavy timber and thick, solid stone. From the outside, it was an imposing, windowless fortress. But inside, it was Kellen's private kingdom, a sanctuary of 1,000 beautiful and exotic sensations. As the great, iron-bound wooden doors were opened for him, a wave of the most incredible air would flow out to greet him, an air thick with the accumulated perfume of the entire world. Let us step inside with him into the deep, cool, and shadowed silence. The first thing to greet your senses is the smell. It is a profound, complex, and deeply calming perfume. At its base is the clean, sharp, and almost sacred scent of cedarwood, the material of the countless neatly stacked crates. You can just feel the cozy, warm, and dusty scent of spices all around. There's the sweet warmth of cinnamon from far-off Ceylon, the sharp kick of pepper from the Malabar coast, and the rich perfume of cloves from mythical islands. It's like a delicious journey for your senses. You can smell the earthy, fresh scent of raw cotton waiting to be used, mixed with a hint of floral luxury from rich, heavy silk. It's like a gentle reminder of those hidden workshops all the way in the Far East, right? The light inside is soft and gentle. The last golden rays of the setting sun filter down from a few high and dusty windows, creating long, beautiful shafts of light that cut through the gloom. In these beams of light, a million tiny dust motes dance and swirl in a slow, silent, and hypnotic ballet. These shafts of light illuminate the deep, rich colors of the warehouse's treasures. They catch on the deep crimson reds and the brilliant sapphire blues of great rolled carpets, stacked like the pillars of some ancient, silent temple. They glow upon the deep, earthy tones of 100 clay amphorae filled with precious oils. They reveal the simple, honest beauty of bales of raw wool, their texture rich and inviting. The only sounds are Kellen's soft footsteps on the smooth stone floor and the gentle creaks of the ancient wooden rafters above, settling in the deep, dark space like a big, sleepy beast getting cozy for the night. Kellan strolled through the aisles of quiet treasures, his fingers brushing against different textures. He loved the rough feel of burlap and the smooth, silky touch of fabric. This was his happy place, a world filled with real, beautiful things that made life feel rich and vibrant. But this warehouse, for all its wonders, was only the public face of his success. The true heart of his kingdom, the source of his deep, unshakable calm, lay hidden away in the deepest, most secure part of his grand house. This was his secret spot. Every night after dinner, he'd grab a heavy iron key and head down a few stone steps into the cool, dry cellar. It felt almost sacred, like a special ritual just for him. Here, set into the solid stone of the house's foundation, was a single massive door, made not of wood, but of solid iron, bound with even thicker straps of black iron. The sound of the great, heavy key turning in the massive lock was a deep, satisfying, and deeply reassuring sound. Clunk, clunk, clunk. It was the sound of absolute security. He would pull the heavy door open, its immense weight groaning softly on its huge hinges, and he would step inside with a single flickering candle in his hand. The air within the vault was cool, perfectly dry, and utterly, completely still. It was the air of a place outside of time, a place that weather and seasons could not touch. And the sight that greeted him in the soft, dancing, golden light of his candle was the sight that brought him the most profound peace. The vault was not large, but it was filled. Along the walls stood great, heavy, open-topped chests of dark, iron-bound oak, and these chests were overflowing with his wealth. A river of gold and silver coins. The candlelight would catch on the surfaces of the thousands upon thousands of coins, and the entire room would be filled with a soft, warm, and liquid golden glow. It was like stepping into a dragon's hoard, into a secret sunlit cave deep beneath the earth. The coins were from 100 different kingdoms, each with its own unique shape and design. Some were large, heavy silver pieces, worn smooth by the touch of 1,000 different hands. Others were small, perfectly preserved, golden coins, their images of long-dead emperors and forgotten gods still sharp and clear. And Kellen, in his nightly ritual, would do something that brought him a deep and almost childlike sense of joy and security. He would reach into one of the great chests, and he would plunge his hands deep into the pile of coins. He would feel the immediate, shocking, and deeply satisfying coolness of the metal. He would feel the immense, collective weight of it, a weight that felt like the very anchor of the world. He would lift his hands, letting the coins slip through his fingers. The sound was a soft, beautiful cascade, like a waterfall of sunlight and moonlight. It shimmered and sparkled, creating a soothing chorus that whispered one simple truth: this was real. This, for Cullen, was the very definition of wealth. This was the source of his profound and unshakable calm. His fortune was not an abstract number in some banker's ledger. It was not a flimsy, easily torn piece of paper with a promise written upon it. It was here. It was real. It was tangible. It was a physical, undeniable fact. He could touch it. He could feel it. He could weigh it. He believed that the world was a chaotic and often treacherous place. Storms could sink ships. Droughts could ruin harvests. The promises of men could be broken as easily as they were spoken. But this gold, this silver, this was a constant. It was a truth that did not change. It was a value that was absolute and eternal. It was the solid ground beneath his feet, the fortress wall that protected him and his family from all the uncertainties of the world. When his ritual was complete, he would close the great iron door. The sound of the heavy bolts sliding home was the sound of his world being made safe and secure for another night. He would walk back up the stairs, leaving his treasure to sleep in its cool, dark, and silent kingdom. He'd crawl into bed, sinking into a deep, peaceful sleep, knowing his world was just right, and everything was exactly as it should be. He had built his fortress, he had filled his treasury, and he believed in his heart of hearts that his peace and his prosperity were as solid, as real, and as permanent as the heavy, sleeping gold in his vault. And perhaps, as you lie here now, you too can allow yourself to feel a sense of this deep and quiet and profound security. You can let go of the ventures and the accounts and the uncertain promises of your own day. You can, for this one peaceful night, close the great, heavy iron door on all your worries. There is nothing more you need to do. There is nothing you need to guard. You can simply rest. Feel the gentle, reassuring weight of your own body, a comforting anchor in the quiet stillness of your bed. And let this feeling of deep and solid and unshakable peace be the gentle, heavy current that pulls you down, slowly, peacefully, and completely, into the deep and quiet and truly valuable treasure of your own untroubled sleep. Chapter 2. The whisper of a new age. The seasons continued to turn, each one a slow, graceful, and predictable dance. Keelan's great stone warehouse remained full, and the chests in his deep, cool vault remained heavy with the reassuring metallic weight of his success. His life was a masterpiece of order and control, a world he had built with his own hands, a world that he believed was impervious to the chaotic whims of fate. He would walk through the city, a figure of immense and quiet authority, and he would see a world that confirmed his own beliefs. He saw the small family shops, solo artists, and one-ship traders, all playing a familiar game, handling real stuff, juggling tight budgets, and taking manageable risks that felt doable. But a new age does not arrive like a crashing wave. It arrives as a whisper, a new idea spoken softly in a quiet room, a new ambition dreamed in the heart of a young and restless captain, a new and daring map unrolled for the first time on a scholar's desk. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the familiar, comfortable, and predictable hum of the great port city began to change. A new and more exciting, and slightly more dangerous, note was entering the symphony. Whispers began to swirl among the powerful, echoing in smoky taverns with flickering candles, bustling merchant courtyards, and the grand halls where the city's money movers gathered. Elias, with his deep connections, heard these whispers. They were stories of a scale and ambition that made even his own considerable achievements seem modest and provincial. They were the dreams of a new generation, a generation that did not just want to sail the known trade routes, but to sail off the edge of the known map. He heard a group of young, ambitious sea captains speaking, their voices low and full of a restless fire. They spoke of a new kind of ship, a carrack, a vessel larger, stronger, and more seaworthy than any that had ever been built in the city's shipyards. A ship that was not designed for the relatively calm, familiar waters of the inland seas, but for the great, unknown, and monstrous swells of the vast, open Atlantic. They did not speak of sailing to Alexandria or Constantinople. They spoke in hushed and reverent tones of sailing south, far down the unknown coast of Africa, in search of a new and perhaps mythical sea route to the Indies. A journey that would take not months, but years. A journey from which they might never return. He heard the city's master builders and engineers, their faces full of a brilliant, creative frustration. They talked about a huge plan to tame the mighty river flowing by the city. The idea was to create a massive network of canals and locks that would open up the lush lands nearby for trade. It was such a big project that it would take 10 years and 1,000 workers to finish. They spoke of draining the great marshlands to the north of the city to create new, rich farmland, a feat of engineering that the old Romans had only dreamed of. These were not just business ventures. They were dreams of empire. They were acts of collective, civic ambition that promised to elevate the city from a wealthy port into the undisputed center of the entire world. But these dreams all had one thing in common. They were too large. They were too expensive, too risky for any single man to undertake. The cost of building one of the new, great ships was more than the entire fortune of even the richest of the city's old established merchant families. The cost of the Great Canal Project was more than the city's treasury could bear alone. The old way of doing things, Kellen's world of solo merchants, each risking their own cash on personal projects, just couldn't support the bigger dreams they had. In the quiet, candlelit halls, a new idea was being born out of this necessity. The idea of the shared venture. The idea that if a risk was too great for one man to bear, it could, perhaps, be borne by many. The financiers began to speak a new language. They talked about joining forces, starting companies, and selling small shares of a big idea to lots of investors. This way, each person risks just a bit, but together they could take on something huge and achieve the impossible. They were, without knowing it, inventing the very foundations of our modern world of investment. A world built on the idea of shared risk and shared reward. Kellen listened to all of this. He sat in the meetings, a quiet, solid, and respected presence. He understood the logic of their new ideas. He saw the undeniable power in this new concept of the shared venture. But in his own quiet and deeply private heart, he felt not excitement, but a faint and almost imperceptible sense of disdain. He saw this new way of thinking not as a sign of progress, but as a sign of weakness. He saw it as a dilution of the very principles that had made him strong. His own success had been built on his own individual courage, his own singular vision, his own personal and tangible wealth. He had never needed to share his risks. He had never needed to ask for the help of others. The idea of owning just a small, insignificant piece of a great enterprise felt, to him, like an admission of inadequacy. His great, silent vault, with its chests of heavy, sleeping gold, had taught him a different lesson. It had taught him that wealth was power, and that power was most effective, most pure, when it was concentrated in a single decisive pair of hands. He watched the eager young captains and bright engineers, feeling their frustration as their big dreams got delayed and picked apart by the cautious financiers. It was like watching their hopes shrink into tiny, safe pieces, and it just didn't sit right with him. He saw their great, singular visions being compromised by the countless, conflicting opinions of 100 different small-minded investors. And in the deep, quiet, and profoundly confident fortress of his own mind, a new and grand and ultimately fatal ambition of his own began to take shape. He saw a way to not just participate in this new age, but to dominate it, to prove once and for all the enduring power of the old way, the power of the single great and decisive individual. He would not become just another small investor in one of their new, cautious companies. He would do something that no other man in the city would dare to do. He would take one of their great, new, and impossible dreams, and he would make it his own. He would fund it in its entirety with his own vast and tangible fortune. He chose his project with a master's eye. It was not the wildest of the dreams, not the mythical voyage to the Indies. He was too wise for that. He chose a project that was a perfect and beautiful and deeply tempting blend of visionary ambition and practical possibility. he chose the venture of the northern farmlands. A consortium of landowners had acquired a vast tract of marshy, but potentially incredibly fertile land, a day's journey to the north. Their dream was to drain this land, a monumental feat of engineering, and to cultivate on it a new and highly valuable strain of wheat that was said to produce a harvest twice as bountiful as any local crop. The project required immense investment to build the dikes and canals, to hire the labor, to purchase the new and expensive seed. The financiers were, as usual, hesitant, breaking the project down into smaller, slower, and less effective stages. Kellen saw his opportunity. He called a meeting. He sat, a figure of immense and quiet power, at the head of a great, polished table, surrounded by the anxious landowners and the cautious financiers. And then he made his move. He did not haggle. He did not negotiate. He simply and quietly made a declaration. He told them that he, Kellen, alone would fund the entire project. He would bear the full, immense, and undivided risk. And in return, he would reap the full, immense, and undivided reward. A stunned silence fell over the room. The scale of his offer was breathtaking. It was an act of financial audacity that the city had never before witnessed. It was a gamble of such epic proportions that it seemed to belong more to the world of emperors and kings than to the world of merchants. The cautious financiers were speechless. The anxious landowners were ecstatic. In a single brilliant and decisive move, Callan had swept aside all the committees, all the compromises, all the timid collective caution of the new age. He had reaffirmed the power of the great individual. That night, for the first time in many years, Highland's visit to his vault was not just a quiet, reassuring ritual. It was an act of triumphant communion. He plunged his hands into his chests of gold and silver, and he felt not just the cool, heavy reassurance of his wealth, but the thrilling, electric, and deeply seductive hum of its immense, concentrated power. This gold, he thought, was not just a dead, sleeping metal. It was an army that he and he alone commanded. And he was about to march it out into the world to conquer a new, green, and fertile empire. He felt in that moment not like a merchant, but like a god. His calm shifted from being cautious to a thrilling sense of peace. Now, he's fully embracing the biggest risk of all, feeling deep down that he's got this, and there's no way he can fail. Chapter 3. The Slow Dissolution. The great venture began not with a thunderous roar, but with a quiet and deeply satisfying hum of purposeful activity. Kellan, now the sole patron of the ambitious Northern Farmlands project, moved with the serene and decisive confidence of a king deploying his armies. The great, heavy chests of gold and silver were brought up from the deep, cool silence of his vault and into the light of the working day. In a huge, echoing room of his warehouse, a temporary counting house was set up. For weeks, the only sound was the soothing clink and chime of coins being counted, weighed, and stacked into neat piles by his most trusted clerks. It was like music to his ears, right? A slow, steady, and seemingly endless river of his tangible fortune began to flow out into the world. It flowed to the master builders, who purchased mountains of stone for the great dikes and legions of timbers for the canal locks. It flowed to the labor masters, who hired hundreds of men from the city and the surrounding countryside, their hands and backs needed for the monumental task of digging and shaping the earth. It flowed to the agronomists, who used it to purchase the finest, most promising seed from distant lands. Kalan oversaw all of this, not with the frantic energy of a gambler, but with the calm, detached precision of a master strategist. Every expenditure was recorded. Every plan was reviewed. He felt a profound sense of power, watching his silent, sleeping gold transform into a living, breathing, and world-changing enterprise. He felt he was not spending his wealth, but merely transmuting it, changing it from a static, solid form into a dynamic, growing one. The first year of the project was a story of perfect, methodical success. The great dikes were built, their massive stone walls rising slowly to hold back the marsh waters. The main canals were dug, straight and true, their channels a testament to the power of human reason to impose its will upon the chaotic landscape of nature. The city's inhabitants would sometimes travel north to watch the work, and they would look upon the vast and ambitious scale of the project with a sense of awe, and they would speak the name of Kellen with a new kind of reverence. He was not just a merchant anymore. He was a visionary, a prince of commerce, the man who was single-handedly bending the very land to his will for the future prosperity of them all. Kaylan would hear these whispers, and they only served to deepen his own profound sense of unshakable certainty. But the world is not a ledger. Its accounts do not always balance in the way a man, even the wisest of men, expects them to. The universe has its own, much older and much more subtle forms of accounting, and the first signs of trouble arrived as gently and as quietly as a change in the wind. It began in the spring of the second year. The winter had been unusually cold, with frosts that had lasted longer and bitten deeper than anyone could remember. When the spring thaw finally came, it came not as a gentle melting, but as a great, sudden rush of water from the northern hills. The new, and not yet fully settled, dikes were put to a test far more severe than the engineers had ever anticipated. They held, but the sheer volume of water, the immense, cold, and relentless pressure found small, secret weaknesses deep in the earth beneath them. The water did not break through. It seeped. It trickled. It found its way, slowly, silently, and invisibly, back into the fields that had been so laboriously drained. The land, which was supposed to be dry and ready for the first great planting, remained a vast, sodden, and unusable mire for many crucial weeks. The first planting season was lost. It was a tough break, and a pricey one too. More gold had to be pulled from the vault to pay the workers for the extra, unexpected task of shoring up the foundations and draining the fields again. But Kellen stayed confident. Such things happen in great enterprises, he told himself. The world will always test the will of a great man. His fortune was vast. It could easily absorb this small initial loss. After summer rolled in and the fields dried up, those first little green shoots of wheat popped up, bringing a glimmer of hope. But then, bam! A long, brutal drought hit the land, turning that hope into worry. The sun, which had once been the symbol of life and the source of his golden wealth, now became a cruel and relentless antagonist. It beat down from a cloudless, metallic blue sky, day after day, week after week. The great canals, which had been designed to irrigate the fields, saw their water levels drop lower and lower, until they were nothing but muddy, cracked, and thirsty ditches. The vibrant green shoots of the precious wheat began to yellow at the tips, then curl and wither into a dry, brown, and lifeless dust. The great promised harvest, the harvest upon which the entire venture depended, was a failure. The news of this second disaster was brought to Kellen in his quiet, cool office. He listened, his face a mask of calm composure. He nodded slowly. He dismissed the messenger. He did not rage. He did not despair. He simply sat for a long time in the deep, profound silence, and he felt, for the first time in his adult life, the cold, unfamiliar, and deeply unsettling touch of a power that was greater than his own. The power of nature's profound and utter indifference to the plans of men. The dissolution, when it began, was not a sudden, catastrophic collapse. It was a slow, quiet, and deeply orderly process. A reversal of the river that he had first set out into the world. Kellen was a man of honor. The failure of the project did not negate the promises he had made. The builders, the laborers, the seed merchants, they had all done their work, and they had to be paid. He began with the same calm, methodical precision with which he had built his fortune to oversee its dismantling. He unlocked the great iron door of his vault, and he began to pay his debts. At first, the change was almost imperceptible. A single heavy chest of gold coins was brought up into the light, its contents counted out and distributed. The vault was still a treasure cave, its riches still seemingly endless. But then, a few weeks later, another chest was required, and then another. He began to sell his assets. A warehouse in a distant port was the first to go. Then a ship, one of the finest in his small, private fleet. Each sale was recorded with his own hand in his own perfect private ledger. There was no panic in his actions, no frantic scramble to save himself. He was like the captain of a great and mortally wounded ship in a calm sea. He knew the ship was sinking. He knew, with a deep and quiet and strangely peaceful certainty, that it could not be saved. And so, his only remaining duty was to manage the sinking with as much grace and order and dignity as he could muster. The great pile of gold and silver in his vault, the great, solid, and tangible mountain that had been the anchor of his soul, began to visibly shrink. It was a slow, gentle, and relentless erosion. It was like watching a great golden sandcastle, built over a lifetime, being slowly, gently, and inexorably reclaimed by a calm and silent tide. Each day, the tide would come in a little further and carry a few more grains of sand away. He would go down to his vault each night, as he always had. But the ritual was no longer one of triumphant communion. It was a quiet and deeply melancholic act of observation. He'd gaze at the dwindling treasure, noticing the empty spaces in the chests, feeling a deep, almost detached sadness instead of fear. It was a bittersweet moment, you know. He was watching his own solid, tangible world, the only world he had ever truly believed in, slowly, quietly, and gracefully dissolving into nothing. Chapter 4. The quiet ruined the slow, gentle, and relentless tide of Kalen's obligations continued its work, washing away his great, golden sandcastle, grain by patient grain. The process was not one of days or weeks, but of many, many months. It was a slow, quiet, and deeply orderly dismantling of a lifetime of work. To the city, the full extent of the disaster was not yet known. Kellen, in his calm and quiet dignity, conducted his affairs with such composure that most believed he was simply restructuring his vast empire. He sold another ship, and then another. He sold his properties in distant cities. He sold the precious cargoes that were stored in the deep, fragrant shadows of his great warehouse. His wealth, once flowing in, now streamed out like a quiet river, taking with it the memories of his past success back to the world that had given them life. He spent his days in his office, no longer a grand chamber of power, but a simple, quiet room of accounts. He would sit for hours with his ledgers, his face a mask of calm, professional concentration. He was not planning new ventures. He was simply and honorably managing his own quiet ruin. He would meet with his creditors, one by one. There were no arguments. There were no desperate pleas for more time. He would look each man in the eye, and he would speak to them with a simple and profound honesty. He would explain the situation, and he would pay them what he owed, in full, as long as he was able. And the merchants, the builders, the shipwrights, they saw in his calm and unwavering honor a kind of integrity that was, in its own way, more impressive than his former great wealth had ever been. Finally, the day that he had known for a long time was coming arrived. It did not arrive with a thunderclap or a storm. It arrived on a quiet, gray autumn afternoon, when the sky was the color of soft, warm pewter, and a gentle, cool rain was falling on the city. A rain that seemed to wash the world clean of all its color and all its noise. His final great creditor, a timber merchant who had supplied the wood for the failed project's canal locks, arrived at his office. He was a good man, and his face was full of a sorrowful respect. Kellen greeted him with a gentle and welcoming nod. He did not offer any excuses. He simply said, "Let us settle our account." Together, the two men walked, their footsteps the only sound in the now mostly empty warehouse, towards the great iron door of the vault. For the last time, Kellen placed the heavy iron key into the lock. The sound of the tumblers turning, a sound that had once been a song of deep and profound security, now sounded like a final, metallic sigh of farewell. He pulled the great door open, its hinges groaning softly, and he stood back, holding his candle high. The vault was almost entirely empty. The great, heavy, oaken chests, which had once been overflowing with a river of gold and silver, now stood like hollow, wooden tombs in the flickering candlelight. They were filled only with shadows, and with the faint, ghostly, metallic scent of the wealth that they had once held. In the very bottom of the last great chest, nestled in the corner, lay a single, small, and lonely stack of gold coins. It was all that remained, the very last solid remnants of his vast and once unshakable fortune. With the timber merchant watching in a deep and respectful silence, Kellen performed the ritual of the counting for the final time. He gathered the small pile of coins. He weighed them on the same magnificent brass scales that had once measured out his triumphs, and he counted them, one by one, his fingers moving with their old, familiar, and practiced grace into the timber merchant's outstretched hand. When he was done, the timber merchant's account was settled perfectly and honorably, and the great, deep, and once overflowing chest was now completely and utterly empty. Kellen stood for a long time in the silent, empty vault. The candlelight cast his long, lonely shadow on the bare stone walls. He looked at the hollow chests. He breathed in the cool, still, and now sterile air. He felt no panic. He felt no terror. He felt no self-pity. He felt only a vast and deep and strangely peaceful emptiness. The great, heavy anchor that had held him and defined him for his entire life was now gone. He was, for the first time since he was a young boy with a single pouch of peppercorns, a man with nothing. And the feeling, to his own profound surprise, was not one of fear. It was a feeling of an immense and quiet and almost beautiful release. He had been a guardian for so long, and now, at last, his watch was over. He closed the great iron door of the empty vault. The sound of the heavy bolts sliding home for the final time was a sound of profound and irreversible finality. He did not lock it. There was nothing left to protect. He then walked, with the timber merchant by his side, through the echoing emptiness of his great warehouse. The change here was even more profound than in the vault. The air, which had once been a thick, complex, and intoxicating perfume of spices and woods and textiles from across the world, was now thin and cold, and smelled only of the faint, clean scent of dust, and of the damp stone, and of the gentle, falling rain outside. The towering stacks of crates and bales were gone. The rich colors of the carpets and the silks were gone. The only things that remained were the long, empty aisles and the great, silent, wooden rafters, high above in the deep, cathedral-like gloom. The warehouse, which had once been the vibrant, beating heart of his commercial empire, a place humming with the secret sleeping stories of 100 different journeys, was now just a great, empty, and silent shell. A hollow monument to a life that was now entirely in the past. He had not just lost his money. He had lost his world. He had lost the very sensations, the smells, the textures, the colors that had defined his existence. And yet, he felt no anger. He felt only a deep and quiet and profoundly melancholic sense of peace. The story was over. The book was closed. He walked the timber merchant to the great doors. The two men, who had been on opposite sides of a great debt, now stood together as equals. As simple men, in the presence of a quiet and momentous event, they shook hands, and they looked at each other with a deep and quiet and profound mutual respect. Kellen then stood alone in the great doorway of his empty warehouse and watched as the merchant walked away, his dark cloak slowly disappearing into the soft, gray, and weeping curtain of the autumn rain. He did not own this great building anymore. He did not own the quiet, elegant house in which he lived. He did not own the fine clothes on his back. They would all, in the coming days, be given over to his remaining creditors. He was no longer Kellen, the great merchant. He was simply Kellen, a man with nothing but his name and his honor and the quiet, empty, and strangely liberating landscape of his own future. He turned and walked back into the vast, echoing and shadowy emptiness of his warehouse. He sat down on a simple wooden crate, the only piece of furniture that was left, and in the deep, profound, and growing silence, surrounded by the ghosts of his own magnificent past, he listened to the soft, gentle, and rhythmic sound of the falling rain, and he began, quietly and peacefully, and without any fear at all, to wait for whatever was to come next. Chapter 5. The Council of Merchants. For a day, and then another, the city did not seem to notice that one of its brightest stars had been extinguished. The great river of commerce continued to flow with its usual bustling and purposeful energy. Ships arrived at the wharves, their sails heavy with the salty air of the sea, and their holds full of new and exotic goods. The markets were filled with the familiar, chaotic symphony of 1,000 different conversations, the clatter of weights on scales, and the constant, musical clinking of coins. To the casual observer, the world was exactly as it had been the day before. But in the quiet, shadowed back rooms of the merchant houses, in the cool, marble halls of the city's financiers, a new and deeply unsettling story had begun to spread. It did not travel as a loud, panicked shout. It moved as a whisper, a quiet, cold, and disbelieving murmur that passed from one trusted clerk to another, from one senior partner to his brother. "Have you heard about Kellen?" The whisper was a cold stone dropped into the warm, placid pool of the city's confidence, and the ripples it created spread outwards, silently and invisibly, touching everything. At first, there was only disbelief. Kellen was not a man. He was a landmark. He was a mountain. And mountains, in the minds of ordinary men, do not simply vanish overnight. But as the day wore on, and the whispers were confirmed by the quiet, sorrowful faces of Kellen's own clerks, and by the sudden, unnerving silence from his great warehouse, the disbelief began to transform into a much colder and much more personal emotion, a quiet, creeping, and deeply rational fear. For Kellen, in his immense success, had become more than just a merchant. He was the sun around which 100 smaller planets revolved. His great ventures had been built upon a vast and complex web of credit, and his promises were the invisible threads that held the city's prosperity together. There was the shipbuilder, who had built Kellen's last, great ship on the promise of future payment. There was the Weavers' Guild, which had supplied him with a mountain of fine wool on credit. There were a dozen smaller merchants who had entrusted their own smaller fortunes to his care, investing in his ventures. And then there were the financiers who had underwritten his great risks. They were all connected to him. They were all, in some small or large way, standing on the foundation of his wealth. And now they had been told, with a quiet and terrible certainty, that the foundation had turned to dust. The panic, when it finally began, was a silent one. It was a panic of quiet, frantic calculations in the back of 100 different ledgers. A panic of sleepless, watchful nights, of men sitting in the dark, staring at contracts that were now suddenly, terrifyingly worthless. They realized with a slow, dawning horror that the ruin of one man, even a great man, was not supposed to matter in this way. The old, unwritten rules of their world were simple. Each man was an island, responsible for his own profits and for his own losses. But Kellen had become more than an island. He had become a continent, and his sinking threatened to create a whirlpool that would pull them all down into the dark, cold, and unforgiving waters of bankruptcy. The old rules, they now understood, were no longer sufficient. The world had become more complex, more interconnected, and the problem they now faced was a new and a terrifying one. And so, on the third night after Kellen had paid his last gold coin, a summons was sent out. It was a quiet, discreet, and urgent call for a meeting of the city's most powerful and influential men, the Council of Merchants. They gathered not in a public hall, but in the private, candlelit, and wood-paneled chamber of the oldest and most respected of the city's financiers, a man named Valerius. They arrived one by one, their faces grim, their movements slow and heavy, like men arriving for a funeral. Imagine the scene. A long, dark, and highly polished oak table, its surface reflecting the soft, flickering light of a dozen thick beeswax candles. The air in the room is heavy and still, filled with the scent of old leather, of beeswax, and of the faint, sharp, and unspoken aroma of collective fear. Seated around this table are a dozen of the city's most powerful men. They are not kings or generals. They are merchants, bankers, and ship owners. Men whose entire lives have been dedicated to the calm, rational, and logical pursuit of commerce. They are not men who are accustomed to panic. They are the calm center of the storm. But tonight, the storm has come for them. They sat in a deep and solemn silence for a long time. The only sound was the soft, almost imperceptible, hissing and sputtering of the candle flames. Finally, Valerius, a man so old that he seemed to have been carved from ancient wrinkled stone, rose slowly to his feet. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it filled the silent room with its deep and quiet and deeply weary authority. "We are all here," he began, his old eyes moving slowly around the table, meeting the gaze of each man, "because we all know that the world we understood yesterday is not the world we live in today. The fall of the House of Kellen is not the simple private ruin of one man. It is a disease. A plague that, if left unchecked, will spread through the arteries of our city and will leave us all impoverished. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the silence. The old ways, he continued, his voice a soft, sorrowful murmur, are no longer enough. The old rule was simple. A man's debt is his own. If he cannot pay, he is ruined and his creditors must bear the loss. But what do we do when the debt is so large that the loss will ruin the creditors themselves? And what do we do when the ruin of those creditors will, in turn, ruin 100 smaller men who depend on them? It is a chain, a terrible, invisible chain, and the first great link has just been broken. We are all now in danger of falling. He looked around the table at the grim, worried faces. We have two choices, he said. We can follow the old ways. We can descend upon what is left of Kalen's estate, like a pack of hungry wolves, each man fighting for his own small scrap, destroying what little is left, and in the process, ensuring our own collective ruin. We can let the panic run its course, or we can choose to believe that we are not a pack of wolves, that we are a city, that we are a community, and that the problem of one of us, when it is large enough, becomes the problem of all of us. His words hung in the still, candle-lit air. He was proposing something radical, something that went against the very grain of their deeply individualistic and competitive world. He was proposing that they think not as rivals, but as partners. He was suggesting that the only way to survive the crisis was to face it, not as a collection of separate, frightened interests, but as a single, unified, and rational body. For a long time, no one spoke. The idea was too new, too strange. But as they looked at each other across the long, polished table, they saw in each other's eyes the same quiet and deeply rational fear. And they knew that the old man was right. The old world was broken. The old rules no longer applied. They were sailing in a new and a terrifying and a completely uncharted sea. And their only hope of survival was to learn to sail it together. The great, comfortable, and predictable age of the individual merchant, the age that had been so perfectly embodied by the magnificent rise and the quiet ruin of Kellen, was over. A new and more complex and more dangerous and perhaps more promising age was about to be born, not in an act of triumph, but here in this quiet, desperate, and candle-lit room, in an act of shared and profound and deeply unwelcome necessity. Chapter 6. The Birth of an Idea, the deep, solemn, and heavy silence in the candlelit chamber stretched on for a long, unbroken time. The dozen men seated around the great, polished oak table were not men who were accustomed to stillness. Their lives were a constant current of motion, of calculation, of decisions made and actions taken. But tonight they were adrift in a calm and terrifying sea of uncertainty. The old maps, the old rules that had guided their lives were now useless. The problem that lay before them was a new and a monstrous one, and they were beginning to understand that the old solutions were as ineffective as trying to catch the wind in a net. One of the men, a shipbuilder named Titus, A man with strong, capable hands and a face weathered by a lifetime of sea spray and hard work finally broke the silence. His voice was not angry. It was the low, flat, and deeply tired voice of a man stating a simple and devastating fact. "The timbers for Kellen's last 2 ships," he said, looking not at any one man, but at the flickering flame of the candle in the center of the table, were the finest oak from the northern forests. My men worked for a full year to shape them. The payment for that timber, and for that year of my men's lives, was due next month. It was a promise from a man whose promises were as solid as the very wood I sold him. Now, he paused and made a small, empty gesture with his large, calloused hands. The promise is a ghost, and my own house is now built on a foundation of air. Another man spoke, a weaver with soft, ink-stained fingers, a man whose fine woolens were famous throughout the land. He took my entire spring shearing on credit, he whispered, his voice barely audible. An entire season's work. Enough to feed my family and the families of all my weavers for the next 2 years. Without that payment, he did not need to finish the sentence. The other men in the room could hear its silent, terrible conclusion. One by one, the stories were told. They were not told with rage or with accusation. They were told with a quiet, shared, and deeply sorrowful sense of disbelief. It was a calm and orderly accounting of their own impending ruin. They were like skilled doctors, gathered around a patient they all loved, calmly and precisely describing the symptoms of a fatal and incurable disease. They spoke of the invisible threads of credit and debt that connected them all, and they now saw, with a terrible clarity, how Kellen, the great, strong, central pillar of their world, had, in his fall, torn the very fabric of their shared prosperity. Valerius, the ancient, wise, and deeply respected financier, listened to all of this without speaking. He sat still and silent, at the head of the table, his old, wrinkled hands resting one on top of the other, his pale, sea-gray eyes half closed, as if he were in a deep and profound meditation. He listened to the quiet litany of their fears, and he understood the true nature of the problem. The problem was not one of man's dishonesty. Kellen had not run away with their money. He had not hidden his assets. He had, with a quiet and unwavering honor, given up everything he possessed. The problem was a new one. It was a problem of scale. The system they had built, the system of individual risk and individual honor, was simply not strong enough to withstand a failure of this magnitude. It was like a beautiful but simple wooden bridge, designed to carry the weight of horses and carts, that had just had an entire castle fall upon it. The bridge had shattered. When the last of the merchants had spoken, and the heavy, sorrowful silence had once again descended upon the room, Valerius finally opened his eyes. He looked slowly at each of the men around the table. His gaze was not one of pity, but one of deep and thoughtful and almost scholarly concentration. He was not just seeing their fear. He was seeing the shape of the problem itself. "We have spent this last hour," he began, his voice a low, dry, and calming rustle, like the sound of old, dry leaves, describing the symptoms of our shared illness. We have all agreed that the patient, our city's commerce, is gravely ill. But we have not yet spoken of a cure, because the old cures, the old medicines that we have always trusted, are now useless to us. He raised a single thin and almost translucent finger. What is the old cure for a debt that cannot be paid? He asked the silent room. We can seize the man's assets, but Kellen has no assets left to seize. We can have the man thrown into a debtor's prison, but locking Kellen in a cell for the rest of his life will not bring back our timber or our wool or our gold. It would be an act of empty and ultimately self-destructive vengeance. The old ways, you see, have brought us to a dead end. They are the medicines for a different and a much simpler disease. He paused, and in the silence, a profound and difficult truth began to dawn on the men in the room. They were trapped. Their anger, their fear, their desire for justice, all of it was useless. They were standing at the edge of a cliff, and the only path forward, the old, familiar path, had just crumbled into the sea. Valerius leaned forward slightly, the candlelight casting deep, thoughtful shadows on his ancient face. He seemed to be thinking aloud, his voice soft and full of a deep philosophical wonder, as if he were a mathematician on the verge of discovering a new and beautiful kind of geometry. We are all, he said slowly, creditors of a single great debt. This is our problem. This is what binds us together in this room tonight. It makes us partners. But we are partners in a past that is dead. We are partners in a great and unchangeable loss. He let that thought settle. But what if, he continued, and his voice was now even quieter, a mere whisper of an idea. What if we were to change the nature of our partnership? What if we were to turn our faces away from the dead and unchangeable past and towards the living and uncertain future? Instead of being partners in a loss, what if we chose to become partners in a hope? The other men looked at him, their faces a mixture of confusion and weary incomprehension. The old man's words were beautiful, but they sounded like the abstract ramblings of a philosopher, not the practical solution of a financier. Valerius saw their confusion, and he continued, his voice now a little stronger, a little clearer, as the new idea began to take a more solid shape in his own mind. Kellen has lost his gold, he said. He has lost his ships. He has lost his warehouses. His tangible assets are all gone. But has he lost everything? No. He has one great and valuable and untouchable asset remaining. An asset that no creditor can seize. He has his knowledge. He has his experience. He has his understanding of the great, wide, and difficult world of trade. An understanding that is perhaps now deeper and wiser than it has ever been. He leaned back, his eyes seeming to glow with a new and gentle inner light. And so, I propose a new idea, a new kind of alchemy. Let us take this great and terrible and worthless debt that Kellen owes us all, and let us, with our own collective will, perform a miracle. Let us declare that it is no longer a debt. A debt is a chain to the past. Let us transform it and call it a share. A share is a key to the future. Let us agree, he said, his voice now full of a quiet and compelling and deeply rational passion, that we will not destroy Callan for his failure. We will, instead, invest in him. We will take the value of the debt that he owes each of us, and we will consider that to be our investment in a new and shared venture. A venture that Callan, with his great and now humbled wisdom, will manage on our behalf. We will all together become the owners of his next journey. If he should fail again, then we have lost nothing more than what we have already, in our own hearts, accepted as lost. But if he should succeed, if, with our collective backing, he is able to undertake a new and more modest and wiser journey, and if that journey should return even a small profit, then we will all, as partners, share in that profit, in proportion to our share of his original and now transformed debt. The idea, in its radical and beautiful and almost magical simplicity, hung in the silent, candle-lit air of the room. He was proposing that they turn a negative into a positive, that they transform a catastrophe into an opportunity, that they alchemize a dead and heavy loss into a light and living and shared hope. He was proposing that they stop acting like individual frightened creditors and start acting like a single wise and courageous company. For a long time, the only sound was the soft, gentle hissing of the candle flames. The merchants around the table were silent, their minds struggling to grasp the shape of this new and strange and deeply unconventional idea. It went against every instinct, every tradition, every rule they had ever known. But as they sat there, in the quiet, desperate, and hallowed space of that room, the deep and simple and beautiful logic of the old man's words began to dawn on them. It was a single, small, and fragile candle of a new possibility, being lit in the deep, dark, and seemingly hopeless night of their shared crisis. Chapter 7. The first shares the deep. Resonant tolling of the city's great bells began to announce the coming of the dawn, the sound rolling like a slow, gentle wave across the quiet, sleeping rooftops. Inside the candle-lit chamber of Valeria's, the council of merchants was drawing to a close. The first pale and ghostly gray light of the new day began to filter through the tall, arched windows, mixing with the soft, warm, and now guttering golden light of the beeswax candles. The atmosphere in the room had been transformed. The heavy, suffocating air of quiet, collective fear had been replaced by something new. It was not a boisterous confidence, nor an easy optimism. It was a quiet, fragile, and deeply thoughtful sense of shared purpose. The old man's radical idea, the idea of transforming a dead debt into a living share, had settled upon them, and in the long, silent hours of the night, it had slowly, quietly taken root. They left the old financier's house one by one, stepping out into the cool, damp, and misty air of the Venetian dawn. The city was a world of soft grays and blues, the canals like ribbons of polished steel, the ancient palazzos like sleeping gray ghosts. And as the merchants walked back to their own homes, through the silent, winding alleyways, their steps were slow, their faces were grave, But their hearts were no longer filled with the cold, hard stone of inevitable ruin. They were filled, instead, with the quiet, tentative, and deeply unfamiliar warmth of a shared and fragile hope. They had walked into this room as a collection of individual, frightened men, each facing his own private abyss. They were walking out now as something new. They were partners. They were, though they did not yet know it, the founders of the world's first company. Valeras did not go to his bed to rest. The birth of a new idea, he knew, was a delicate and a crucial moment. It required immediate and careful nurturing, lest it die in the harsh, logical light of the coming day. He sent out his messengers, and by the time the sun had fully risen, casting its first warm golden rays upon the city, a different kind of council had been assembled in the great, silent and marble-floored main hall of his own bank. These were not the city's great merchants, but its finest minds. The most learned scribes, men whose calligraphy was a form of high art. The most respected notaries, men whose understanding of the intricate laws of commerce was legendary. And the finest paper makers, men who knew the secrets of creating documents that could last for centuries. He stood before them, a frail but immensely authoritative figure in the vast, echoing hall. And he began to explain. He spoke slowly, quietly, and with a deep, philosophical clarity. He did not speak of profits or losses. He spoke of the nature of a promise. He spoke of the difference between a debt, which is a chain that binds a man to his past failures, and a new idea, the idea of a share, which he described as a key that could unlock the door to a shared and prosperous future. The learned men listened in a deep and captivated silence. They, more than anyone, understood the profound and almost magical power of a carefully worded document. They understood that the entire magnificent edifice of Venetian commerce was built not on gold or on ships, but on the simple and sacred power of words written on a page. The task before them was to invent a new kind of word, a new kind of document. For what, precisely, was a share? It was not a loan agreement, for there was no promise of repayment. It was not a deed of ownership, for the asset it represented, a future and uncertain profit, did not yet exist. It was something new, a hybrid, a thing of pure and hopeful imagination. For many hours, a quiet, scholarly, and deeply thoughtful debate took place. They would take a large piece of scrap parchment, and the scribe, his hand moving with a slow, exploratory grace, would write out a draft of a sentence. And then the old wise men would discuss it, their voices a low, gentle murmur in the quiet hall. They would argue over the choice of a single word, the placement of a comma, the precise, legal, and almost spiritual meaning of each phrase. Slowly, line by careful line, the new idea began to take a physical, textual form. They decided to call the documents certificates of shared venture, a beautiful and an honest name. They wrote that the bearer of the certificate was not a creditor, but a participant, a beautiful and a hopeful word. They wrote that the certificate represented a portion, not of a debt to be collected, but of a story yet to be told. a story of a new caravan, a new journey, a new beginning. They wrote that it entitled the bearer to a portion of all future profits, but that it also, and this was the most revolutionary part, bound him to share in any future losses. The risk and the reward were now to be forever and inextricably intertwined. They were not just creating a financial instrument. They were writing a new and a more mature and a more honest social contract. When the precise, legal, and poetic language of the new document had finally been agreed upon, the time came to create the first real physical object. This was a moment of quiet and profound ceremony. The master papermaker was summoned. He brought with him his finest creation, a paper that was thick and strong and creamy, made from the purest linen rags, with the watermark of the city's winged lion, a ghostly and beautiful image, held deep within its very fibers. This was a paper that was designed to feel important, to feel permanent. Then the master scribe was summoned. He came forward, carrying his own personal and most treasured tools, his own private inkwell, filled with an ink of the deepest, most permanent, and most lustrous black, and his own favorite pen, a long, perfectly balanced quill from the wing of a great sea eagle. He stood before a clean, empty desk. He laid down the first perfect and virgin sheet of the new paper. He took a slow, deep, and centering breath, and then he began to write. The only sound in the entire, vast, and silent hall was the soft, dry, and impossibly beautiful scratching of his pen. It was the sound of a new world being born. He wrote with a slow and almost religious concentration. Each letter was a perfect work of art. Each word was a monument to the new idea. He wrote the name of the new venture, the Kellen Recovery Company. He wrote the precise fraction that this single certificate represented of the whole. And he wrote the beautiful, and now legally binding words that they had all so carefully crafted, the words that defined the bearer as a participant, a partner in a shared hope. When the writing was complete, the document was brought to Valerius. He read it over, his old eyes missing no detail. He gave a single satisfied nod. Then, from a small wooden box, he produced his own personal seal and a stick of deep crimson sealing wax. The wax was melted in the clean, blue flame of a small spirit lamp, and a single, perfect, and glistening pool of red was dripped onto the bottom of the page. Valerius pressed his seal, the symbol of his own unshakable personal honor, into the warm wax. Then the seal of the Merchants' Guild was added beside it. The document was now complete. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a vessel that contained the full and combined and legally binding trust of the most powerful men in the city of Venice. Pause. The final act of the day's quiet revolution was the exchange itself. Titus, the shipbuilder, the man who's honest and sorrowful, words had begun the council the night before, was summoned to the bank. He entered, his face still full of a quiet and weary resignation. He walked to the counter, and from within his tunic, he produced the promissory note he had been given by Kellen. a note that he now believed to be completely and utterly worthless. He placed it on the polished counter. It was a record of a dead promise, a relic of the old, broken world. The Leariers stood on the other side of the counter. He took the old, worthless note, and without looking at it, he placed it to one side. Then, with both hands, he picked up the new, beautiful, and still slightly warm certificate, and he presented it to Titus. Titus took it. He looked down at the document in his large, work-worn hands. He saw the beautiful, elegant script. He saw the powerful, crimson seals. He read the words. He did not, perhaps, fully understand all of their complex legal meaning, but he understood the feeling. He understood that the old, heavy, and dead weight of his expected loss had been lifted from him, and in its place he now held this strange and new and impossibly light object, an object that was not a memory of a past failure, but a tangible and a beautiful and a legally binding promise of a shared and hopeful future. The alchemical transformation was complete. The heavy and worthless lead of a great debt had been spun into the light and precious, and now very, very real gold of the world's first share. Chapter 8. The second venture for many weeks, Callan remained in the quiet, echoing emptiness of his former life. He lived in a small, borrowed room at the back of the old inn, a space with a simple bed, a wooden table, and a single window that looked out onto a quiet, mossy courtyard. The great, roaring river of his former wealth had slowed to a complete and total stillness. He owned nothing. He expected nothing. He had paid his last coin, surrendered his last asset, and he was now simply waiting for the final, logical conclusion to his story, a summons to the debtor's court, and then the quiet, gray, and timeless oblivion of a prison cell. He did not feel fear. He did not feel anger. He felt only a profound and deeply weary and strangely peaceful sense of resignation. He had played the great game, and he had lost. The story he believed was over. Then, one morning, a young apprentice from the Bank of Valeriers arrived, his face full of a quiet and respectful solemnity. He did not carry a summons or a warrant. He carried a simple, sealed letter. The letter requested Callan's presence at the bank at his earliest convenience. Callan took the letter. His hand, which had once signed contracts that could move entire fleets of ships, was now the hand of a simple and powerless old man. He expected this was the beginning of the end. He put on his last, clean, and simple tunic, and he walked with a slow and dignified and untroubled step through the familiar city streets towards the grand marble hall of the city's oldest financier. He was not led to a courtroom or to an interrogation chamber. He was shown into Valerius's own private and sunlit office, a room filled with ancient, beautiful maps and the quiet, scholarly scent of old books. Valerius was seated behind his great, polished desk, and he rose with the slow grace of a very old man as Callan entered. He did not greet him as a creditor greeting a ruined debtor. He greeted him as an equal, as a fellow veteran of the great and sometimes brutal campaigns of commerce. He gestured for Kellen to sit. "You have lost your fortune, Kellen," Valerius began, his voice a soft and gentle murmur. "And in doing so, you have almost destroyed us all. The old rules would demand that we take from you what little you have left, which is nothing, and then we would take your freedom. The old ways demand an eye for an eye, a ruin for a ruin." He paused, his ancient sea-gray eyes looking at Kellen with a deep and profound and deeply compassionate understanding. "But," he continued, "we have decided that the old ways are no longer sufficient for the new and complex world we now inhabit. We have decided that vengeance is a currency that impoverishes everyone who trades in it. We have chosen, instead, to invest in a different and a more hopeful currency. We have chosen to invest in wisdom." "Your wisdom?" Kellen stared at the old man, his mind unable to process the meaning of his words. Valerius then explained. He spoke of the council, of their shared crisis, and of the new, strange, and radical idea that had been born from their desperation. He explained how Kellen's great and catastrophic debts had been alchemized, transformed from a record of a past failure into a promise of a future hope. He spoke of the new and beautifully crafted certificates of shared venture. He explained that a new company had been formed, a company owned in small fractional pieces by every man that Kellen had owed money to, a company whose sole asset was a single, intangible, and yet immensely valuable thing, Kellen's own, hard-won, and now deeply humbled experience. "We have created a new ship, Kellen," Valerius said, his voice now full of a quiet and profound and deeply moving sincerity. "It is a new kind of ship, a ship built not of timber and nails, but of the shared hope of all your former creditors. And a ship, even a new and unusual one, needs a captain. It needs a man who knows the sea, a man who has weathered the storms, a man who understands, now more than ever, the true nature of the risks involved. We are asking you to be that captain." Kellen sat in a state of profound and utter silence. He could not speak. A moment ago, he had been a ruined man, waiting for the end. And now he was being offered not charity, not forgiveness, but something far more precious. He was being offered a responsibility. He was being offered a chance, not to reclaim his fortune, but to vindicate the trust of the very men he had failed. A slow, hot, and unaccustomed tear, a tear not of sorrow, but of a deep and overwhelming and profoundly humbling gratitude, formed in the corner of his eye and traced a slow, silent path to the dusty landscape of his weathered cheek. The preparations for the second venture were entirely different from the first. There was no grand, triumphant, and solitary display of power. There was, instead, a series of quiet, collaborative, and deeply thoughtful meetings. Kalan was no longer a king, acting on his own singular vision. He was a chief minister, serving a council. He would sit at the great, polished table with the other merchants, the men who were now his partners, his employers. He would lay out his plans for a new and much more modest trading caravan. He was a different man. The old, brilliant, and sometimes reckless audacity was gone. It had been replaced by a deep and quiet and profound humility. His past failure had been a harsh but a powerful teacher. He was more careful now, more thoughtful. He listened more than he spoke. He saw risks that his younger, more arrogant self would have dismissed. He saw opportunities in small and overlooked corners of the market that he would have once considered beneath his notice. And the other merchants, the men who were now his partners, saw this change in him. They saw his new and quiet and deeply earned wisdom, and their fragile and necessary hope began, slowly, to transform into a solid and a genuine confidence. The new caravan was assembled. It was a modest affair, a mere shadow of the great private armies he had once commanded. But every piece of it, every camel, every burlap sack, every water skin was chosen with an almost religious care. For he was not just spending money now. He was spending the collected hope of other men. The burden of this new kind of responsibility felt, to him, far heavier and far more sacred than the mere physical weight of his own lost gold had ever been. The day the caravan departed, it was not with a great public fanfare. It was a quiet and sober and deeply purposeful affair. As Kellen took his place at the head of this small, dusty procession and led them out through the city gates and into the vast, silent, and familiar landscape of the great desert, he felt as if his life had come full circle. He was a young man again, setting out on his first great adventure. But he was also an old man, returning to the world with a new and a much quieter and a much wiser soul. The journey was a familiar one, but he experienced it with new senses. When he had traveled this way before, as a great and wealthy merchant, he had been insulated from the world by his own importance. He had slept in a large, luxurious tent and had eaten the finest foods prepared by his own servants. Now, he was just a man among other men. He slept on a simple blanket under the vast, silent, and diamond-studded canopy of the desert sky. He shared the simple, common meal of dates and flatbread around a small, crackling fire. He felt the true, biting cold of the desert night. He felt the real, searing heat of the midday sun. And in this new and direct and unadorned connection to the world, he felt more alive and more at peace than he had in 50 years. He was no longer traveling with the constant, low-level anxiety of a man who is guarding a great and tangible treasure. He was traveling instead with the deep and constant and strangely uplifting weight of a great and intangible responsibility. The first was a burden of the self. This new one was a burden for others. And it felt, to his surprise, not like a weight at all, but like a purpose. It gave his steps a new and a lighter and a more meaningful rhythm. They traveled for many months, and they finally reached the distant, bustling markets of the East. And here, too, Kalan was a different man. The old, brilliant, and sometimes intimidating merchant, whose very presence could dominate a negotiation, was gone. In his place was a quieter, more patient, and more compassionate trader. His own great and humbling failure had taught him to see the world through other men's eyes. He could now sense their fears, their hopes, their needs. And this new and profound empathy made him a far better and a far wiser negotiator than he had ever been before. He made a series of small, careful, and remarkably successful trades. He did not seek the single great and risky prize. He built his success slowly, patiently, and safely through 100 small and honest and mutually beneficial transactions. The caravan was loaded for the long journey home. Its cargo was not a spectacular and legendary treasure. It was a solid and a sensible and a carefully chosen collection of goods that he knew would fetch a modest but a definite and a welcome profit in his home city. As he turned his face towards the west and began the long, slow, and patient walk home, he looked back at the distant, exotic city, and then ahead at the vast and empty and beautiful expanse of the desert, and he felt a kind of quiet and deep and profoundly satisfying joy that was entirely new to him. It was not the exhilarating and slightly arrogant triumph of a great man who has bent the world to his will. It was the quiet and humble and deeply peaceful satisfaction of a simple craftsman who has been given a difficult and an important task, and who has through his own careful and honest and dedicated work proven himself worthy of the trust that was placed in him. The journey was not just about recovering money for other men. It was about recovering something far more precious for himself. It was about the slow and patient and deeply satisfying journey of recovering his own lost honor. Chapter 9. The shared return, the long, slow, and patient journey home was a mirror image of the journey out, but the heart of the caravan and the heart of the man who led it had been transformed. The quiet, disciplined, and purposeful atmosphere of the outward trek was now subtly infused with a new and deeply gentle feeling. It was the quiet, unspoken, and deeply satisfying feeling of a difficult promise that was on the verge of being kept. Kellen, as he guided the modest procession across the vast and unchanging and beautiful silence of the great desert, felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more profound than any he had ever known, even in the days of his greatest wealth. He was not returning with a legendary treasure that would make the city gasp in awe. He was returning with something far more precious and far more fragile. He was returning with the quiet and hard-won and still unproven hope of other men resting gently in his careful hands. As the caravan drew closer to the city and the distant, familiar smudge on the horizon slowly grew into the great soaring walls of his home, a new kind of anticipation began to build, not just in Kellen, but in the city itself. News of the caravan's impending return had traveled ahead of it, a quiet, hopeful whisper that moved through the markets and the counting houses. And on the day of its arrival, a small and silent and deeply anxious crowd had gathered by the city's southern gate. They were not the usual, boisterous and curious crowds that gathered to greet a great, rich caravan. They were the shareholders. Titus the shipbuilder was there, his strong, capable hands clasped nervously before him. A master weaver was there, his gentle, scholarly face full of a quiet and almost painful hope, and a dozen other merchants, the men whose ruin had been transformed into a share in this new, strange, and desperate venture, all stood together. They were not shouting. They were not cheering. They were simply waiting, their eyes fixed on the dusty road, their hearts filled with a silent and collective and deeply personal prayer. They were not just waiting for a caravan of goods. They were waiting to see if the new and beautiful and fragile idea of their shared trust had survived its first great test in the harsh and unforgiving reality of the world. The caravan that appeared was a modest sight. Just a small, dusty procession of tired camels, led by a quiet, white-haired old man. There were no grand displays, no triumphant banners. But as it passed through the city gates, and the waiting merchants saw the calm, steady, and honorable expression on Callan's face, a great, silent, and collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through them. He had returned. Their fragile hope was still alive. The true and final test, however, was not one of arrival, but of accounting. The following day, the same dozen men who had once gathered in a state of quiet panic now gathered once more in the great, silent, and candlelit council chamber of Valerius's bank. The atmosphere was different. The heavy, suffocating air of fear had been replaced by a thin and highly charged and almost electric air of tense and hopeful anticipation. Callan stood at the head of the long, polished table. He did not stand as a king or as a commander. He stood as a humble steward, ready to give an account of his service. The process that followed was a masterpiece of the new era they had, together, created. It was a process of complete and quiet and methodical transparency. The cargo from the caravan was brought in, bale by precious bale, and its quality was assessed, not by Callan alone, but by a committee of the shareholders. The price for each item was agreed upon, fairly and openly. The total value of the returned goods was calculated, the number written with a slow, careful, and steady hand at the top of a clean, new page in a new ledger, a ledger that was titled simply the Callan Recovery Company. Then, Callan presented his own, meticulously kept, account books from the journey. Every single expenditure, from the price of water at a desert oasis to the fee for a market license, was recorded. The other merchants, men who were themselves masters of this craft, examined the books. They saw not just the numbers, but the story behind them. They saw the story of a journey that had been managed with an almost impossible level of care, of frugality, and of a deep and profound and unwavering honesty. When all the revenues had been calculated and all the costs had been subtracted, the final and most important calculation was made. A single senior clerk, his hands moving with a slow and steady rhythm on a great wooden abacus, made the final sum. The soft, quiet clicking of the wooden beads was the only sound in the deeply silent room. He finished. He checked his work once, then twice. Then he looked up at the dozen anxious and waiting faces, and he spoke a single quiet and beautiful word: profit. It was not a vast profit. It was not the kind of legendary, fortune-making profit that the old Callan would have sought. It was a modest and a sensible and a deeply, beautifully real prophet, a quiet but definite and an undeniable victory. A soft, collective, and deeply satisfied sigh of relief went through the room. The fragile seed of their hope, planted in the dark, desperate soil of their shared crisis, had not died. It had grown, and it had, against all odds, borne fruit. Now came the final and most revolutionary act, the distribution. The clerk took out the file that contained the beautiful and strange and powerful new documents, the certificates of shared venture. He took the final profit, and he began to divide it, precisely according to the fractional share that was written on each man's certificate. He called the first name, Titus, the shipbuilder. Titus, the strong man whose face was a mask of stoic calm, but whose hands were visibly trembling, stepped forward. He handed the clerk his certificate, the beautiful, but until this moment, entirely theoretical piece of paper. The clerk checked it, made a note in the ledger, and then he turned to a small waiting chest filled with silver coins. He counted out a small, but not insignificant, pile of silver, and he placed it, not in a bag, but directly into Titus's large, open, and waiting palms. Titus looked down at the coins. He felt their cool, solid, and wonderfully real weight in his hands. This was not a promise. This was not a hope. This was a return. It was real. It was tangible. It was the physical, metallic proof that the beautiful and strange and magical idea of the old man, Valerius, was not just the rambling of a philosopher. It worked. He had taken a piece of paper that represented a dead and worthless debt, and he had exchanged it now for a pile of real and shining and undeniably valuable silver. A small miracle had just occurred here in this quiet, candle-lit room. One by one, the other shareholders were called forward, and one by one, they performed the same quiet and sacred ritual. They exchanged their paper promise for a real and tangible return. When the last man had been paid and the profit had been perfectly and honestly distributed, a new and a different kind of silence fell upon the room. The anxiety was gone. The tension was gone. And in its place was a deep and a quiet and a profoundly satisfying sense of shared achievement. They had faced a new and a terrifying and a seemingly impossible problem, and they had solved it, not with the old and brutal and selfish tools of the past, but with a new and a cooperative and a deeply intelligent and a profoundly hopeful idea. They looked at the small piles of silver that now rested before them, and then they looked at each other. They looked at the men who had, for their entire lives, been their rivals, their competitors, and they saw them now in a new and a different light. They saw them not as rivals, but as partners. They had all together faced the storm, and they had all together sailed their small, strange, new ship into a safe and a peaceful, and a now very, very real harbor. The quiet revolution, born of a desperate night, had just had its first, and its most beautiful, and its most resounding success. Chapter 10. The new system, the quiet and profoundly satisfying. Success of the Kellen Recovery Company was more than just a financial event. It was a spark. A single brilliant spark of a new idea that had been struck in a moment of darkness and desperation, and which now, in the aftermath of its first modest success, began to glow with a bright and a steady and a deeply intriguing new light. The small piles of silver coins that the merchants now held were real, and they were welcome. But the true and lasting treasure that they had gained from the venture was not the silver. It was the idea, a new and a powerful and a deeply transformative way of thinking about the very nature of wealth and of risk and of community. That evening, the merchants did not disperse to their own private and solitary counting houses to lock away their new small profits. Instead, they gathered together in the quiet, respectable tavern that they frequented. But the atmosphere was different. The usual conversations of prices and cargoes and rivalries were gone. Tonight, their voices were low and excited and full of a new and a shared and a deeply intellectual energy. They were not talking about money. They were talking about the beautiful, new, and elegant machine that they had, together, invented. They marveled at the alchemical magic of how a dead and worthless debt had been transformed into a living, breathing, and profitable enterprise. They spoke of the quiet and profound and previously unimaginable strength they had discovered, not in their own individual vaults, but in their own collective and shared trust. It was Valerius, the ancient and wise financier, who gave a name to their new discovery. "We have spent our lives," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur in the quiet, candle-lit room, acting as individual streams, each of us trying to carve our own private path to the sea. And when one of us, even the greatest of us, ran dry, we all suffered. But with this venture, we have, for the first time, learned to flow together. We have created a river made of our shared trust, and we have discovered that the river is stronger than any single stream. The idea, once proven, was too powerful to be ignored. A few weeks later, when the young ambitious sea captains once again came to the council with their grand and impossibly expensive dream of building the new great Carrack ships to explore the unknown African coast, the conversation was entirely different. Before, their dream had been met with the cautious and ultimately paralyzing wisdom of the old ways. But now, the merchants looked at the project with new eyes. They saw not just the immense and terrifying individual risk. They saw the immense and exciting collective opportunity. They did not dismiss the idea. Instead, they began with a new and a shared and a deeply collaborative energy to plan. They formed a new company, the African Voyage Company, and they created 100 new and beautiful certificates of shared. Venture 100 shares, and these were quickly and quietly bought by all the great and small merchants of the city, each man now owning a small, hopeful, and manageable piece of a great and magnificent dream. And with the birth of these new companies, these new and numerous paper promises, a new and unexpected phenomenon began to occur. The certificates themselves, the beautiful and elegant, and watermarked pieces of paper began to take on a life of their own. They began to move. They began to flow. Imagine a wool merchant, a man who owned a single small share in the new African Voyage Company. His share represented a promise of a great profit, but a profit that was still 2 or perhaps 3 years away. But the merchant suddenly finds himself in a tight spot. One of his own smaller ships has been damaged in a storm, and he needs a small amount of real, physical silver now to pay for its repairs. In the old world, he would have had to go to a moneylender and take out a loan at a high rate of interest. But now, he has a new option. He takes his beautiful and hopeful paper share certificate, and he goes to the quiet marble hall of Valerius's bank. And there, he meets another merchant, a man whose own ventures have been successful, and who has a small amount of idle capital that he wishes to put to work. The two men talk, their voices a low, respectful murmur. The first merchant explains his situation. He offers to sell his share, his piece of a long-term hope, for a small amount of immediate and necessary silver. The second merchant, who has the time to wait for the ships to return, and who believes in the venture, agrees. A price is settled upon, and they perform a new kind of transaction, a quiet and a deeply significant and a profoundly revolutionary act. They go to a scribe, and the scribe takes the first merchant's share certificate, and on the back of it, he writes in his clear and elegant script that the ownership of this promise has now been transferred to the second merchant. The second merchant hands the first a small, heavy pouch of silver coins, and the deal is done. A piece of a future, and an imaginary profit has just been bought and sold. The paper promise has just acquired a value and a life all of its own, entirely separate from the great and distant and still sailing ships that it represents. Valerius, the wise old man who saw the deeper patterns in the flow of commerce, observed this new and organic activity with a deep and profound sense of satisfaction. He saw that his partners now needed a place to conduct this new and secondary kind of trade. And so, he set aside a special, quiet, and dedicated room in his great bank for this very purpose. This was the birth of the world's first stock exchange. But it was not the noisy and frantic and chaotic place that we might imagine today. It was a room of deep and quiet and civilized order. The walls were paneled in a dark, calming wood. The air was cool and still. At one end of the room, a great, polished slate board was hung upon the wall, and upon this board, a scribe with a piece of soft, white chalk would write the names of the active ventures: the Kellen Recovery Company, the African Voyage Company, the Northern Farmlands Reclamation Trust, and beside each name, he would write the last agreed-upon price at which one of its shares had been traded. The merchants would come and go throughout the day. Their movements were slow. Their voices were hushed. They would stand before the great slate board, their faces full of a deep and a quiet and a thoughtful concentration. They were not gambling. They were reading the collective mind of the city. They were watching the subtle and ever-changing ebb and flow of shared hope and of shared fear. When a transaction was agreed upon, they would simply go to one of the scribes who sat at the small individual desks that lined the room, and the transfer of ownership would be recorded with a quiet and a calm and a deeply satisfying efficiency. The very nature of wealth in the city was changing. Before, a man's wealth was a static and a heavy and a deeply private thing. It was the gold that slept silently and unproductively in his own personal vault. But now, a new kind of wealth had been born, a light and a dynamic, and a fluid and a deeply public kind of wealth. A man could now own a small piece of a dozen different ventures. He could own a piece of a ship, battling the waves of the Atlantic. He could own a piece of a canal, being dug through the patient earth. He could own a piece of a distant and hopeful harvest. His wealth was no longer a single vulnerable anchor. It was a fleet of small, nimble, and resilient boats. The river of value, which had once been a collection of separate and often stagnant individual streams, had now been channeled into a single, great, and interconnected delta. A delta that flowed with a new and a powerful and a deeply life-giving energy through these new and beautiful and now universally trusted paper certificates. And Kellan, the man whose own great and terrible ruin had been the catalyst for this entire quiet revolution, was a frequent visitor to this new, calm room. He owned nothing. He traded nothing. He was simply an observer. He would stand for hours at the back of the room, a quiet, white-haired, and deeply respected elder statesman. The younger merchants would often approach him to ask for his advice, for his opinion on the weather patterns in the south, or on the quality of a certain kind of timber, and he would give his advice freely and gently. And he would watch. He would watch the numbers on the great slate board change. He would watch the quiet, confident, and orderly flow of the paper promises from one hand to another. And he would feel a sense of quiet and detached and profoundly philosophical wonder. He had spent his life believing in the absolute and singular power of his own solid gold. And now he was witnessing the birth of a new and a far more powerful and a far more resilient kind of wealth. A wealth that was built on nothing more and nothing less than the shared and the collective and the beautifully fragile and now beautifully organized trust of other men. Chapter 11. The Old Merchant's Legacy. The years continued their slow, gentle, and inexorable procession, like a great, calm river flowing ever onwards to the sea. The new system of shared ventures, the quiet, orderly, and miraculous invention that had been born from the ashes of Kellan's ruin, became the new heartbeat of the city. The small, quiet room in Valerius's bank grew into a grander, more established hall. The single slate board was replaced by several, and the list of ventures grew longer and more ambitious with each passing season. The certificates of shared venture the paper promises became as trusted and as valuable as gold itself, and their light and fluid and dynamic energy powered the city to a new and an even greater era of prosperity and influence. The age of the solitary merchant king was over. The age of the collective company had truly begun. And what of Callan, a man whose own great and personal storm had, so accidentally, irrigated the fields for this new harvest? He did not vanish from the city's story, but his role within it underwent a final and a quiet and a deeply profound transformation. By a quiet and unanimous and deeply respectful decree from the Council of Merchants, he was granted a small but comfortable lifetime pension. It was not an act of charity, but an act of honor, a quiet acknowledgement of the great and now legendary role he had played, not just as the catalyst for the new system, but also for the immense and unwavering honor with which he had met his own ruin. He moved from the small, borrowed room at the back of the inn. He did not return to a great, grand house, for he had no need and no desire for such things anymore. He chose instead a small, clean, and quiet set of rooms on the upper floor of an old, respectable building that overlooked one of the city's smaller and more peaceful canals. It was a place of deep and simple comfort. His days, which had once been a frantic and complex tapestry of global logistics and high-stakes negotiations, now found a new and a much slower and a much gentler rhythm. He would wake with the sun, not with the anxious mind of a man whose fortunes depended on the day's news, but with the quiet, open curiosity of a man who has nothing to win and nothing left to lose. He would spend his mornings in the slow and meditative pleasure of reading the books of history and philosophy that he had never had the time to open in his former life. In the afternoons, he would walk. He would avoid the new, bustling financial district, the place that was now the loud and vibrant heart of the new system he had helped to create. He preferred, instead, the older, quieter, and more forgotten corners of the city. He would walk through the labyrinthine alleyways, and he would sit for hours on the stone steps of a small, sun-drenched and deserted piazza, watching the gentle everyday life of the city unfold, a life from which he was now completely and peacefully detached. He did not live in obscurity. He had become, in his old age, a different kind of landmark. He was no longer a symbol of wealth or of power. He had become a symbol of wisdom. The new, young, and brilliant merchants, the ones who now traded in the paper shares of the great new companies, would often seek him out. They would find him on his quiet bench in his quiet square, and they would approach him with a deep and a genuine and a slightly awestruck reverence. They did not come to him for financial tips or for secret knowledge of the markets. They came to him for something far more valuable. They came to him for his story. They would ask him, their voices soft with the respect that was usually reserved for great scholars, what it had felt like. What had it felt like to command a fortune that could build a city? And what had it felt like to watch it all turn to dust? Callan would look at these eager, intelligent, and ambitious young men, and he would see in their eyes the same brilliant and dangerous fire that had once burned in his own heart. And he would speak to them, his voice a low and a calm and a gentle murmur. He would not speak of numbers, or of profits, or of losses. He would speak of the desert. He would speak of the sea. He would speak of the feel of a gold coin in his hand, and of the profound and terrifying and ultimately liberating feeling of the empty vault. He spoke of his own great failure, not with shame or with bitterness, but with a quiet and a gentle and a deeply honest sense of wonder. And the young men would listen, and they would learn a lesson that they could not learn from any ledger or from any balance sheet. They would learn that wisdom is not born from success, but is often the quiet and precious and unexpected child of a great and a devastating and a fully accepted failure. In the long, quiet evenings, he would often sit by his open window, watching the last of the light fade from the sky and watching the deep, dark, and silky green water of the canal below him. And it was in these long, silent, and solitary hours that he would reflect on the great and beautiful and deeply profound irony of his own long life. He had spent his entire life believing in the tangible. He had believed in the solid, the heavy, the real. He had built his entire philosophy of life on the unshakable foundation of his own personal and carefully hoarded wealth. He had seen his fortune as a great, solid mountain of gold, a thing of permanence, a fortress that would protect him from the winds of change. But his own story, he now understood, had proven that even the greatest and most solid of mountains can be washed away into the sea by a single, unexpected, and powerful storm. His great monument to permanence had been, in the end, an illusion. And the new system, the beautiful and resilient and prosperous system that had been born from the ashes of his own ruin, was the complete and the perfect and the beautiful opposite of everything he had once believed in. It was not a solid mountain. It was a flowing river. It was a mist. Its strength was not in its solidity, but in its fluidity. Its power was not in its concentration, but in its diffusion. The wealth of the city was no longer held in a few great and vulnerable private vaults. It was now held in 1,000 small and light and flexible paper shares, flowing constantly from hand to hand. A single ship could now sink. A single harvest could now fail. A single merchant could now be ruined. But the system, the great collective river of shared trust, would flow on, its course only momentarily and slightly disturbed. He had tried to build a fortress of stone, and he had failed. And his failure had, entirely by accident, taught the city how to build a far stronger and far more enduring fortress of water and of air. He saw, with a clarity that was completely free of ego, or of pride, or of regret, the true and final shape of his own legacy. His greatest and most enduring and most important contribution to the world, he now understood, was not his magnificent success. It was his magnificent failure. In his great and proud and ultimately arrogant attempt to prove the singular power of the old way, he had created a crisis so deep and so profound that he had forced the birth of a new and a better and a more resilient way. He had not, as he had once dreamed, built a great and lasting empire of his own personal gold. He had, instead, and entirely by accident, laid the foundation for a new and a far greater and a far more enduring empire of their collective trust. He would look out from his window at the city as the first soft, golden lights began to appear in the windows of the houses on the other side of the canal. He would see the lights of the city that was thriving and growing and prospering on the back of the new and powerful and flexible idea that had been born from his own personal and catastrophic loss. And he felt no bitterness. He felt no envy. He felt no regret. He felt only a deep and a quiet and a profoundly peaceful sense of wonder. He had finally, at the very end of his life, understood his own story. He was not the hero who had triumphed. He was not the villain who had failed. He was simply the catalyst. He was the hard and unforgiving and necessary stone against which the city had, in its moment of darkness, struck the first brilliant and life-giving spark of a new and a better idea. And that, he realized, as the deep and peaceful and star-filled night settled over the quiet canal, was a far greater and a far more interesting and a far more beautiful legacy than a simple and a silent and a long-forgotten vault full of sleeping and useless gold. Chapter 12. Closing sleepy reflection, the moon, a thin silver sliver, began its slow, silent climb into the deep indigo sky above the sleeping city. In his quiet room, overlooking the dark, still water of the canal, the old merchant Cullen had finally found his peace. His long and winding journey, which had taken him from the simple certainties of his youth to the dizzying heights of immense wealth, and down into the deep, quiet valley of a total and humbling ruin, had at last brought him to a place of gentle and profound understanding. He had learned the final and most difficult and most beautiful lesson of his trade, that sometimes the most valuable thing a man can create is not the empire he builds, but the space that is left behind when that empire has turned to dust. For it is only in that quiet, empty, and fertile space that something new and unexpected, and often far more beautiful, can finally begin to grow. And now, as Kalen's own slow and gentle breathing begins to merge with the quiet, rhythmic pulse of the sleeping city, let us too let his story go. Let us allow the image of the old merchant, and of the bustling ancient port, and of the quiet candle-lit council chambers to soften and to blur and to dissolve like a beautiful and a cherished and a now fully understood dream upon waking. The story has served its purpose. It has carried us to this quiet and thoughtful and peaceful shore, and it leaves us with one final, gentle, and hopeful whisper. A whisper that says that even our greatest losses are not always endings. That sometimes they are the harsh and the necessary and the ultimately benevolent act of clearing away the old, dead wood to make way for the new, green, and tender shoots of spring. And perhaps as you lie here now, in the deep and the safe, and the profound quiet of your own room, you can hold this gentle thought in your own heart. Think of your own day that is now a part of the past. Perhaps it held its own small and quiet ruins. A project that did not go as planned. A conversation that ended in a misunderstanding. A moment of frustration, or of sadness, or of simple and profound weariness. We all have these moments. We all build our own small and hopeful sandcastles, and we all must sometimes watch as the slow and inevitable and completely impersonal tide comes in to wash them away. But the lesson of our story is a gentle one. It reminds us that this is not a tragedy. It is simply the rhythm of life. It is the way of the world. And the space that is left behind, the quiet, empty shore after the tide has receded, is not a place of failure. It is a place of possibility. It is the clean slate, the fresh start, the quiet and fertile and necessary ground from which a new and a wiser and a stronger idea can begin its slow and patient and hopeful growth. Let us think for a moment of the act of sleep itself. For is it not, too, a kind of quiet and a voluntary ruin? It is a gentle and a willing and a deeply necessary loss. It is the act of letting go of the entire, vast, and complex empire of your own waking consciousness. It is the moment when you willingly surrender your control, your thoughts, your plans, your worries. You allow the solid and predictable and well-defended fortress of your ego to dissolve, to melt away into the vast and the mysterious and the boundless and the deeply healing ocean of your own unconscious mind. You are performing, in your own quiet way, an act of immense and a profound trust. You are trusting that the day is truly over. You are trusting that the work is done. You are trusting that the world can and will continue to spin perfectly well for a few hours without your watchful and anxious supervision. And you are trusting that this act of surrender, this nightly loss of the self, will not be an ending, but will, in fact, be the very source of your own personal and beautiful new beginning. For it is only in the deep and the dark and the silent and the utterly mysterious ruin of sleep that the true and the magical and the life-giving restoration can occur. It is the quiet and nightly and miraculous failure of your consciousness that allows for the brilliant and the hopeful and the daily triumph of its own rebirth in the clean and the fresh and the brand new light of the morning. And so now it is time. It is time to let the day go. It is time to allow the quiet and gentle and welcome ruin of sleep to begin. Imagine all the thoughts and the worries and the half-finished stories of your waking day. And imagine them now as the great, solid, and magnificent sandcastle that you have built. And now feel the gentle and the slow and the irresistible tide of sleep beginning to come in. Feel its first soft and foamy waves washing around the base of your ankles, a feeling of gentle and spreading warmth, a slow, quiet, and beautiful dissolution. Let the tide wash over your body, a gentle, warm wave of heaviness flowing up into your legs, making them feel heavy and limp and profoundly, wonderfully at rest. Another slow and even deeper wave flowing up into your hips and your back and your stomach, allowing you to sink just a little deeper into the softness beneath you. Let the gentle, cleansing tide wash over your shoulders, carrying away the burdens you have carried all day. Let it flow down your arms to the tips of your fingers, Let it flow up through your neck and into your head, quieting the busy thoughts, soothing the tired mind. The tide is coming in. The beautiful and complex and now completely unnecessary sandcastle of your day is dissolving, grain by gentle grain. And it is a beautiful and a peaceful and a deeply, deeply restful thing to behold. Letting go now, just letting go. The old ground is being cleared, the space is being made for the quiet and the deep and the restorative and the profoundly creative work of the night to begin. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to hold. Only this gentle and slow and irresistible and wonderfully peaceful dissolution. Into the deep, into the quiet, into the calm, into sleep. Sleep now, sleep, gently, peacefully, quietly. Sleep